Hello and welcome everyone. My name is William Avis and I'm a Research Fellow with the Governance and Social Development Resource Centre, GSDRC, based at the University of Birmingham. I'm very pleased to see we have so many people tuning in online to participate in this event. This is the 9th in a series of public events that GSDRC has been organising for the UK Department for International Development, which form part of DFID's professional development activities for its own staff. These include a series of reading packs, e-learning courses, and other publications. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on our website after the event. The focus of today's webinar is urban governance. The effective management and governance of urban areas has emerged as one of the principal objectives of international development. Goal 11 of the Sustainable Development Goals talks of the need to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. And the third target under this goal focuses on enhancing inclusive and sustainable urbanisation and capacity for participatory, integrated and sustainable human settlement planning and management. Urbanisation and governance of urban areas has thus been identified as an important frontier issue that will increasingly become a core part of many donors' advisory work. In terms of format for today's webinar, a number of questions will be poised with the discussants asked to respond. Questions that will include: what do we mean by urban governance? How can more effective pro-poor urban governance be supported? And what is the role of the international community in all of this? We also invite questions from the audience that will be addressed in the second half of this webinar. Feel free to type in your questions in the chat box that you should be able to see on your screen at any point during the conversation. We'll be finishing up in about an hour and a half from now at 4 p.m. UK time. So on to our discussants. I'm pleased to welcome Jaideep Gupte and Robert Muggah, who will be acting as discussants today. Jaideep Gupte is a Research Fellow based at the Institute of Development Studies and co-lead of IDS's Cities Cluster. His research interests focus on urban violence, poverty and development. Other research interests and expertise include micro-level politics and economics of slums resettlement, informal justice, security in slums, and using GIS and GPS-aided mobile data collection platforms for spatial research. Our second discussant is Robert Muggah. He is the director of the Igarape Institute. He directs several projects on international cooperation, peace support operations, transnational organised crime, citizen security and violence prevention and humanitarian action in non-war settings across Latin America and the Caribbean. In 2012, he was an advisor to the high-level panel on the post-2015 development agenda and the Global Commission on Drug Policy. So by way of a little context, the 21st century has been referred to as the first urban century, with more than 50% of the world's population living in urban areas. Rapid urbanisation has been identified as both an opportunity and a global risk. Urban centres drive economic growth and offer economies of scale in terms of productivity and public investment. They are social melting pots, centres of innovation and drivers of social change. However, cities are also marked by social differentiation, poverty, conflict and environmental degradation. By 2050, the share of urban population is projected to increase to 66%, with the highest rates of urban growth expected in low and middle income countries. India, followed by China and Nigeria, will account for 37% of projected growth in urban populations. An estimated 828 million people live in slums today. This number is expected to double by 2050. Further to this, while cities occupy only 2% of land, they account for an estimated 70% of economic activity, 60% of energy consumption, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, and 70% of global waste produced. Whilst data regarding the rate and scale of urbanisation and urban poverty are open to debate, it is clear that poverty in licks and mix is increasingly taking on an urban character. An estimated third of the global population live in slums or informal settlements. In Central African Republic and Sudan, for example, over 90% of the total urban population reside in slums. Managing urban growth is therefore one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century. The challenge is most acute in the poorest and most fragile states, especially those of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Expanding urban populations are placing increased strain on already overburdened and ill-equipped local government planning mechanisms, infrastructure and urban finance. In many areas, the population has increased faster than the capacity of planners to provide houses and infrastructure, and local businesses to provide jobs. This has led to the emergence of large slums, crime, an expanded informal economy, increased social tensions, and environmental degradation. Increasing attention is focused on the role of urban governance in seizing the opportunities presented by urbanisation and mitigating some of the challenges. This raises a number of pertinent questions. First and foremost, what is urban governance and why does it matter? Jaideep, perhaps I could ask you to provide opening comments on this question.
Sure. Thank you, William. And first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for everyone who's joined in today. This is a very big question, William. But I guess simply put, you could argue that half of humanity lives in towns and cities today, as you've said, and the ways by which institutions or groups, individuals relate to one another in these places and organize their day-to-day lives is how I understand urban governance. Now, these relationships and ways to organize need not be mediated by formal institutions, far from it. In fact, much of urban governance, particularly in the cities that I study, is sort of best understood in terms of hybrid arrangements that involve formal, informal, and even at times illegal actors. So why does it matter? Now, governance arrangements at the most basic level matter because they have tangible impact on people's lives. Now, whether this is through formal labor markets or arrangements that govern informal livelihoods, whether they determine where people can buy or rent homes, for instance, who provides water, other services like sanitation, electricity to these homes. Now, if by circumstance you find yourself excluded from these provisions, then urban governance matters a great deal to you. Now, this argument is easily made for the big megacities that often take all the headlines and end up as travel destinations for many of us. But you might ask why, for example, urban governance or governance institutions and arrangements matter in the smaller, sort of unheard of towns and smaller cities in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Well, I mean, these might not, in these locations, the outcomes might not matter to you and I, but of course, as I've mentioned, they matter a great deal to residents of that town. And indeed, this is the case for more than half of the urban population globally that live in these smaller towns. And just to put a sort of qualification mark on this, and I'll end here, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has famously said that the battle for sustainable development will be won or lost in cities. So that sort of underscores the importance of urban governance at a global scale as well.
Great, thank you, Jaideep. Robert, any further comments on that?
No, I think Jaideep's covered it. I mean, this emphasis on formal and informal institutions, essentially modern and customary forms of organization, this idea of hybridity. These are all the kinds of concepts I think we hear a lot about these days in sort of the urban studies field. And when we talk about governance, the importance is that it's not just about essentially strengthening or bolstering or reforming municipal institutions of governance, strategic planning and budgeting, but it's also about how do you find ways to facilitate quality relationships between different parts of the city, between different groups, and create a means of engagement, of predictable consultation between various groups. One thing I would just say, and we'll get into this I think in the course of the discussion, is that I think cities are increasingly in a way moving towards engaging in various forms of global governance, collective action, both across borders and within national borders with each other. Typically we've seen, when we look at nation states, we look at countries, we talk about almost a marketplace where cities compete almost autonomously from one another. I think what we're seeing increasingly are cities also forging very important linkages. And this raises some really important questions, especially in those areas where we're going to see the most rapid urban growth in the coming century, really in the coming 30 years, which is that the dynamics and definitions of what is urban of what are cities, about how cities cooperate and interconnect, will be, I think, quite different from those of the previous century. And so if we use as our models the evolution of cities in North America, Western Europe, and even some of the more colonial cities of Africa and Asia as the template for the future, we may be narrowing our vision unnecessarily and really at our own peril. And the final point I'd raise, and this is maybe a little bit pedantic, but I think it's worth thinking about, is that you mentioned already, William, that although we know cities are going to be defining the future landscapes of security and development, we understand through the SDG process that cities need to be inclusive. There's a great, enormous amount of interest in cities across sectors, across disciplines. We know surprisingly little about what's going on in small, medium, and even large and frankly mega cities around the world. We tend to be mesmerized by the 30, 35 mega cities, these enormous urban conglomerations. But actually, when you start scraping down a little bit, what you find is we know virtually nothing about what's happening in precisely those areas where the vast majority of urban growth is going to take place over the next 30 to 40 years. And we know very little indeed about what's happening in many of these informal, what's called slum, shantytown, favela-type settlements, where frankly they've been the domain of ethnographers and urban geographers, and there's been very little penetration of a wide array of social scientists. And we'll talk a little bit about the metrics of how do you measure fragility and resilience in cities, I think, later on in this discussion. But I've spent the last couple of years trying to scrape together data on this, both structured and unstructured data. And what I find most remarkable is we know very little about this urban revolution that's taking place.
Great, fantastic. I find this kind of notion of systems of cities that you seek to want to expand out into kind of global, regional, national, and local to kind of really understand how urban areas interact, not just with their immediate vicinity, but also in a kind of a global marketplace. I think perhaps that's something we can pick up later in the discussion and return to. By way of a brief summary then, so I think we can agree that urban governance is just the process by which local, national governments and stakeholders decide how to plan, finance and manage urban areas. It's important to realise that this is not just about the formal structures of city government, but encompasses a host of economic and social forces, institutions and relationships, both formal and informal. Why does this matter? Urban governance plays a significant role in determining the distributional aspects of growth. It influences whether the poor and disadvantaged benefit from economic growth, determines how the poor bring their influence to bear, and whether political and institutional systems, processes and mechanisms, formal and informal, facilitate inclusive and pro-poor decisions and outcomes. It is clear that there is a need to better understand what makes urban governance more or less effective. Broadly speaking, effective governance is seen to be participatory, transparent and accountable, as well as equitable and promoting the rule of law. Discussions of effective urban governance are often associated with normative values, i.e. with good governance ensuring that political, social and economic priorities are based on a broad consensus and the voices of the poorest and most vulnerable are heard and acknowledged in decision making. However, according to UN Habitat, urban areas suffer from an imbalance of political power and insufficient inclusiveness and participation. Collective decision-making has often failed to address the gap between broader national development agendas and inhabitants' needs at the local level. Whilst representative democracy is considered an important vehicle, allowing citizens to exercise their rights, participatory processes often suffer from structural constraints with women, youth, minorities, the urban poor, those with disabilities, etc., often excluded from decision making. Maximising the potential of urban areas requires institutionalising mechanisms of coordination, planning and accountability between diverse stakeholders. However, most city governments face severe capacity constraints, lack the vision to address urban growth and need better information on poverty, environment and services. I think this picks up on the data point Robert was talking about. I think the next question we're going to move on to is, Tom Goodfellow's made an intervention. He's supporting Robert's last point about how little we know about the urban revolution. He also highlights that it's worth mentioning that there is a revived debate on what urban really even means, and the way in which this is understood and measured varies hugely by country. This raises important questions about what we mean by urban governance. And I think this is a very important question. You know, this notion of urban is differently understood by different national governments, and I think this requires further investigation. So, in terms of the next question, what are some of the elements that contribute to effective urban governance, and how does this nurture fairer and more inclusive urban cities that work for the poor? Robert, Jaideep, any preference on who answers this one?
I can react quickly. I mean, just to quickly respond a bit to Tom, because I think it leads us into the next question. There is a question, one of the fundamental questions we really should start by is what is urban and what is the city? And I don't want to get into a Geography 101 class here, but there is a huge variation in how governments, administrative authorities describe cities. And this goes back to the 1930s with the evolution of the whole field of human geography. And without sort of belaboring the point, different countries, different administrative regions will ascribe different definitions to what is a city and what is the periphery. And these typically follow a model of the inner core, followed by a secondary circle of mixed commercial residential area, followed by a third circle, which is sort of a periphery, followed by the fourth circle, which is the rural hinterland. That kind of four concentric circle model has dominated thinking, and probably dominates the thinking of many people working for DIPIT for at least a century. And I think what's interesting is that model is also criticized for being insufficient. It focuses too much perhaps on the administrative layers or even the geographical layers, and minimizes in a way the social interactions between these different concentric circles, the relationships in both directions between them, and also the new emergent forms of cities, which, frankly, most of the new urban growth doesn't conform to this kind of four concentric circle model. Often it starts on the outside and builds the in, or it has a very tiny inner core with a mass sprawling hinterland. So this is an important fundamental question, because how we describe the growth of cities varies regionally and by country. And the vast majority of urban growth isn't necessarily towards megacities, that vision of the Mumbais, the Calcuttas, the Lagoses, and the Manilas. It's actually smaller cities very rapidly becoming bigger cities. And so in some parts of the world, you might describe, in Canada, for example, where I am right now on holiday, the definition of a city is 1,500 people in a concentrated area. In Beijing, it's 1,500 people per square kilometer. In Japan, it's anything over 50,000 people. So you have different variations, and so how we understand about the relationships between cities, I think, requires a little interrogation of what we mean by city. The second point, I think, before we can answer the solutions, it might be worth sort of describing what we mean by fragility in cities. And I think the different people will define this differently, and it's sort of an evolving area of reflection. But I think, the way I would describe fragility in cities, as we think about solutions, is when you have the social contract that links, essentially, urban authorities to citizens. When you have a rupture or a degradation of that relationship, a disequilibrium between the expectations and all the accompanying services that are enabled by city authorities, both public and private, and citizens. And when this disequilibrium becomes, let's say, too dynamic, too uncontrolled, too unpredictable, then often you see fragility exhibited in the administration of basic services. And by basic services, I mean everything from public security, law and order, all the way through to the provision of basic health, hygiene, and other entitlements. And what happens when you see this disequilibrium, I think, is the emergence, or at least the dominance, of certain other forms of parallel forms of governance, which can be liberal or illiberal, as Jaideep was saying. That can be positive in the sense that they provide a whole array of services and can bolster, in some cases, the basic formal rule of law, but also can be illiberal, can be administered or managed by criminals, vigilante groups, neighborhood watch groups, and may not necessarily advance in the medium to long term the wider collective interests of all of society in a meaningful way. And so fragility isn't a constant condition. It's not a permanent condition. I think it's a fluctuating set of properties. I think all cities, including London, exhibit various forms of fragility. But it's when you have the clustering of certain forms of acute risks, and when you have the disequilibrium at a particular high vibration, that I think you see the most likely exhibition of the properties of fragility. So, solutions. I don't profess to have all the answers. I speak from my experience in the Americas and parts of Africa. And even there, I think there's a huge amount of learning that's still going on. But I think one of the preconditions of seeing cities, municipal regions, redefine them, moving forward positively, is when you have, and this is going to sound a little bit cliched, but enlightened leadership, strong positive leadership, and not just from one mayor, but from a succession of mayors, when you see a continuity of I would say, applied and concerted policies being introduced. There's a tendency in many cases, just at the state level, as so it happens at the sub-state and municipal level, plans that were initially crafted being thrown out after 4 years, which results in a huge amount of, let's say, unproductive dynamism. So I think often where we've seen really successful emergence from fragility, you've seen local authorities exhibiting a high level of leadership. You also tend to have a relatively high level of discretion for mayors. Mayors should have an ability to be able to make policy, but also potentially to tax. This is not the case in many jurisdictions in Africa and Asia. Mayors are much stronger, I think, in the Americas. This is a historical byproduct of their own political evolution. And it's a big question mark right now. When you have presidentially appointed mayors in many African cities, how do we ensure some continuity of policy across time and space? And then I'll just say 4 very quick points in terms of strategies. First, I think it's very important that we see participatory, you've already mentioned William and Jaideep, but participatory institutions, mechanisms of consultation, so as you can inculcate a certain form of ownership, engagement with plans that are being developed. Second, a coherent, a reasonable level of proficiency around planning, especially when it comes to budgetization, prioritization of plans, and communication of those plans. Often you can have great technocrats working in a mayor's office or in a municipal jurisdiction, but they're really crap at getting the word out and explaining what in fact is taking place. A third, I think, and it's a really big one, is around positive and progressive investment in physical and social infrastructure. Cities that tend to invest in equity, in inclusivity, and by that I mean the investment in public spaces to bring down barriers between wealthy and poor areas, to support public transport in a way that allows basic services to be accessed and allows individuals to move in and out of cities. Creation of meaningful opportunities for young people. These kinds of progressive physical and social investments in infrastructure, I think, often are accompanied with success. And then finally, I'd say, just because we are living in a world where 2/3 of the world's cities are in coastal areas, and we are facing both immediate and long-term risks of climate change, cities that develop basically municipal natural disaster plans that upgrade their zoning and building codes to foster mixed and residential housing, that cultivate new technologies, that develop early warning systems and have literally a risk management plan to prepare for some of these challenges, because just a few inches rise in water in some of these cities can have devastating consequences across the board for both residential and commercial development. These kinds of strategies, I think, are critical to reducing fragility.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that intervention, Robert. Jaideep, over to you for any further comments.
Thanks. And I'd like to sort of, quite agree with Rob's characterization of what urban is and what fragility is. I think those 2 articulations set up this discussion rather well. Now, in terms of, there's an interesting dichotomy relating to what is successful or effective urban governance, right? And this, to me, stems from 2 opposing ideological views, almost, on the role urban areas play in development. And Rob has hinted to some of these tensions already. But to me, on the one hand, you have governments that are often wary of extremely rapid urbanization. They're actively looking for ways to control it. And yet, on the other hand, they're very eager to reap the economic benefits that cities bring. And the tensions inherent in pursuing these sort of diametrically opposing views at the same time result in essentially exclusionary cities that are created through strategies that put economic growth first, and as a result actually end up leaving many people behind. Now, these types of spiraling inequalities in urban areas are now recognized as a failure in urban governance. Right? I mean, we know that, at least in the context of urban development, the Kuznets curve does not hold. Right? And an interesting way to showcase this is to look, for instance, again at the housing market, right? Where the lack of purchasing power amongst low-skilled labor and indeed recent rural migrants forces them to live in increasingly marginalized parts of the city, and this ghettoization becomes somehow entrenched in the urban fabric. Right? So there's no Kuznets curve to really speak about. You can see similar dynamics in relation to social identities, in relation to certain cohorts, in relation to gender, where outcomes might be skewed towards men or women, and also in relation to spatial inequalities, right? So where, for instance, crime and violence may be concentrated in particular parts of the city. So what works? And again, Rob sort of gone through quite an interesting and broad range of ideas that have really taken a hold and are now being highlighted as best practices and lessons learned from across the world, really. But what works, I guess, to sort of sum up what Rob was saying, is a type of urban governance that is sensitive to inclusion. Right? And in SDG terminology, I guess you could say urban governance that's aimed truly at leaving no one behind. I think that phrase is catching on quite well. Now, but what does that mean? So essentially that involves recognizing the drivers and mechanisms of exclusion in urban areas and tackling these issues from above and below. Right? So that means reorganizing the system of governance to be decentralized, providing more authority to local city institutions, because in the end, they're the ones that have the greatest incentive to respond to the needs of city dwellers, citizens, as Robert calls them. But also from below, so giving voice and safeguarding the rights of the most marginalized. Right? So importantly, this means sort of examining quite closely how urban governance systems can accommodate the growing low-income populations and seek to include them, seek to sort of bring them within the city rather than to exclude or evict or worse, to criminalize them. Now, of course, again, and Rob pointed out to this, that one size cannot fit all. So local solutions are extremely important. I mean, the range of urban conurbations, varying by their size, their nature, is just one hint at the complexity of the urban condition. You have a huge array of outcomes that differ from neighborhood to neighborhood, from street to street. So you need to take these sort of variant outcomes into the fold. But there are, as Rob says, there's strong lessons that we have learned in terms of making governance sustainable, making it transparent, accountable. And one point, I wanted to add on to Rob's list is that these changes or these examples that we've seen in effective urban governance don't happen overnight. So as Rob mentioned, you need a succession of mayors. Another, as for example in the city of Medellin in Colombia, there was a succession of mayors that achieved the goals that we now highlight as success stories. Across the globe, in India, one of the examples that's often highlighted is the National Slum Dwellers Federation, sort of putting together, collectivizing voice for the most marginalized, and and achieving quite significant results in terms of housing rights. But this, their first achievement took them 10 years to do, and this is a really interesting story that Joaquin and Sheila Patel and others tell. That these things didn't happen overnight. Some of us learned of them overnight, but it certainly took them 10 years to get their first few steps. So that to me would be some of the features that contribute to effective urban governance.
Excellent, fantastic. So I think we all agree that it's problematic, whilst it is problematic to generalise across cities regarding elements of effective urban governance, certain factors can be discerned. Effective urban governance depends not only on local institutions and actors, though they are of pivotal importance, but also on the framework set by regional and national governments, the city-national regional interface, if you will, which establishes a connection between what happens in the city and broader regional and national development. I think both Jaideep and Robert highlighted that this is particularly important in relation to those areas that border official boundaries of cities but may not fall within their administrative responsibilities. I think expanding municipal capacity to plan, manage and finance urban growth was highlighted as a fundamental component of effective governance. I think both highlighted that it's important that each level of government, national, regional and local, has sufficient capacity to carry out responsibilities, ensuring that physical and socio-economic planning processes are well coordinated, legally enforced, importantly inclusive and cross-sectorial. I think both highlighted that some municipalities have found that they need to have the human capacity, financial resources or the ability to meet new obligations. And finally, I think the both highlighted a critical factor shaping the extent to which cities develop in a sustainable and pro-poor manner is how cities' local political systems operate. Urban governance is often neither inclusive nor participatory. Large gaps exist in access to social, economic and political opportunities for the poor and their ability to participate in and leverage the benefits of urban living. Governance frameworks are required to encourage policy coordination at local and regional levels and include, importantly, the voices and participation of the poor, but most importantly, leave no one behind. As noted, expanding urban populations are placing increased strain on already overburdened, ill-equipped local government, planning mechanisms, infrastructure and urban finance. This has led to the emergence of large slums, crime, an expanded informal economy and increased social tensions. While some governments have been able to leverage the opportunities of urban growth to develop more inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable cities, many have failed. This is particularly the case in fragile states that have limited capacity to either plan or manage urbanisation. Cities, particularly those in fragile states prone to vulnerability, manifested in increased rates of crime, violence, conflict, terrorism, with accelerating urbanisation. Commentators caution that some cities may be pushed to collapse. So, given this stark warning, how can effective urban governance be developed in fragile states and cities, i.e. those with the most limited capacity? And what role can it play in nurturing the development of more resilient urban areas and societies? Robert and Jaideep have both written extensively on this subject. So perhaps, Robert, I could ask you to pick up on some of your comments that you made in a recent reading pack for GSDRC, which will circulate after this webinar.
Right. I mean, I think we've covered a fair bit already. I think between Jaideep and I'm happy to go into greater detail. I mean, I think there's a couple of rules of thumb that are worth reflecting on. And they don't need to be applied in a doctrinaire manner, but I think they're useful in the back of your mind. I mean, the first point I mentioned is that where we see, I think, successful measures to try to address frailty or fragility in cities, in other words, to address that disequilibrium, and to address that issue of the service gap and some of those fundamental governance challenges we mentioned, is when you have interventions that are data-driven. And I don't want to get too pedantic about this, and I know that researchers and others tend to drone on about how important research is to all of this, but where you've seen successful measures, and where my strengths are really in the law and order question, the criminal justice question, is when you have good, reliable, verifiable, spatially, let's say, comprehensive, demographically widespread, and temporally, available data in order to supply decision makers with the basic baselines and also the measures against which to measure progress over time. Now that's so basic, and I know that's a big challenge at the national scale. It's been one of the Achilles' heels of the whole MDG process, and I know the SDG process and the various IEGs are reflecting on this. But I think too often we focus at the macro scale or even at the state scale, and we've missed the whole city equation. And I will show later in this session a data visualization that looks at over 2,100 cities around the world with some baseline data to start that conversation. But if we don't have baseline data at the meso level, at the city scale, because often what mayors want is a dashboard of the 5 or 10 key metrics to give them a sense of the pulse of the city, but more importantly, micro-level data to get us a better sense about the extent of both delivery of services and access to services, to get a sense of perceptions and attitudes of people towards the government and the services, then I think we often are operating in the dark. It's sort of akin to trying to have a small flashlight on the big elephant metaphor, where we only understand one small part of the issue without understanding the entirety. And I think mayors are acutely sensitive to this. I think, remember, I mean, they're highly accountable often to their constituencies in ideal case scenario. They're often very pragmatic, sort of doers. They're not necessarily established long-term politicians, although in Latin America, the mayorship is a stepping stone to the presidency. In most parts of the world, mayors tend to come from the public in general. Again, I don't want to idealize and romanticize mayors, but I think they do tend to have a much more pragmatic sense and a fine-tuned sense of what's happening on the ground, and I think are open and more receptive to innovative public-private partnerships to generate that kind of information. So where you've seen success, you've often seen observatories that have been set up, usually a combination of research, private and public actors coming together and creating close to real-time data. There's a whole lot of innovation in the technology space, the new technology space, around creating really interesting pulses or barometers of cities using remote sensing data or unstructured data available through, for example, public transport or through pollution emissions or through luminosity or through citizen complaints on social media. So there's no excuse anymore for not being able to develop really quality, relatively inexpensive data monitoring systems. So the first principle is data-driven. The second principle, I think, is evidence-informed. We often talk about evidence-based. That's a pretty high bar. And even in the public health and criminology communities, there's big disputes about what qualifies as evidence-based. You need a randomized control trial to be able to have a minimum, let's say, confidence in the acceptability of an intervention. I think the jury's, it depends on which discipline you're in, and I'm sure this is an endless conversation within DFID, but I think the point is that you should have at least a minimum of evidence-informed approaches to your interventions. There are many urban-style interventions out there, both in infrastructure and in the social policy space, that just don't work. Building bigger roads will not solve your traffic dilemma. But building public transport systems, that are predictable with good lighting, often do have an important effect on reducing, road traffic, and also have all sorts of ancillary benefits in terms of crime prevention and other things. So, there are some strategies that we know on the basis of reasonably good scientific evidence that work. Let's double down on those, and let's discard or dispense with those interventions that we know often do not work. And the third point, I think, is problem-oriented. So data-driven, evidence-informed, and I'd say problem-oriented strategies. And we're seeing this being applied in the law enforcement, policing, and justice sectors increasingly. But we need a minimum analytical capability in mayor's offices and in the associated administrations to be able to define problems and to be able to cogitate around them and come up with solutions to them. It's incredible how often you'll see a problem emerge in a city, like, say, human trafficking, or a sudden jump in gun crime, or a whole bunch of kidnappings. And literally, the city authorities, or in this case, the law enforcement specifically, don't have any clear response to it. They just amp up the number of police in the streets. They don't have a capability of actually identifying the problem, thinking through the data, coming up with solutions, and intervening. This is a really, again, really bread and butter stuff, but where we see it applied, we tend to see a higher outcome, more positive outcome. I'll hand over to Jaideep to fill in the
Yeah.
Thanks, Rob. That goes on about the sort of minutiae of data and data sets. So apologies for that. But just to give you a sort of a quick characterization of why data sets are important in this regard, but also the difficulties in having data that's comparable across across time, but also across locations. And this picks up on a question that I've seen Ed Bell put up on the chat as well. Now, in terms of India, the context that I'm most familiar with, for instance, the Indian Penal Code is long, extensive. It is outdated, but the nuance involved in applying certain penal codes is so sensitive to what the local police officer or constable has in mind. So, for instance, you can have injury with a sharp object as opposed to injury with a blunt object, and often these types of differentiations classify the crime as violent and life-threatening, or could classify the crime as not violent and not life-threatening. And often one type of crime involves having a magistrate involved and jail time, and others don't. And so quite often the incentive for the beat policeman or beat policewoman is to register crimes in such a way that it minimizes their job, right? And in India, unfortunately, the resources are so poor for the police services that often these judgments are based on the amount of paper that's left in a police station to record the crime, whether or not they have a pen or a pencil to record that crime with, whether or not they have enough, the few rupees that are needed to buy food for if you incarcerate somebody in your police lockup. So these are all the kind of decisions the beat policeman or woman has to make before they sort of, and they're the starting point of where all of this data comes from. A couple of other broader points that I'd want to make. Often safety and security is equated with order in urban areas, right? And this is a bit of a theoretical conceptual point, but not too long ago, I mean, it was assumed by urbanists like Le Corbusier and others, for instance, that unruliness in a city could be just planned away if you had rational planned interventions into the organization of the city. And the argument was twofold, right? So that on the one hand, you needed the physical layout and design of urban spaces to be ordered, and on the other, you needed the processes and structures of urban governance to also be ordered, right? And as Rob's pointed out here, but also in a number of his pieces that he's written over the past years, is that these points of view really need to be seriously qualified and need to largely be reconfigured, particularly in the context of fragile states and fragile cities. Right? It needs to be recognized that a technocratic approach to ordering urban space can in fact be extremely oppressive and violent, particularly towards the most marginalized and those that are already facing a heightened risk of insecurity from violence, conflict, or natural disasters. Now, a second point I wanted to make in this regard was that a key component of urban governance in fragile cities, and again here I'm using fragile in the sense that Robert introduced at the start of this webinar, is including the right stakeholders, the right decision makers, and the right actors in all aspects of urban governance. Now, what does that mean? Right, so first of all, this is a view that's not uncommon now, right? It's being increasingly voiced. Like, for example, if you look at the draft New Urban Agenda that UN Habitat is working through at the moment, now it calls for the integration of crime prevention strategies across all urban planning. Now, this is, as I said, an increasingly popular point of view, but it's easier said than done. Right? So what does it mean on the ground? So for starters, to me it means inviting urban police forces to the discussion table. Now this might be very straightforward or relatively straightforward in Chicago or London, but it's not straightforward at all in Karachi or Kinshasa, right? Where security actors, and I say actors because often they're just as involved in sort of creating insecurity and perpetrating violence as they are in providing security. So security actors in these cities range from state police forces to paramilitaries to non-state armed groups to vigilantes, youth groups, and not all these groups are strictly urban. Right? So, for example, in DRC, we saw rampant rural violence and instability spill over on the streets of Kinshasa. So, integrating crime prevention and violence mitigation strategies into urban planning at large is very messy, it's extremely difficult, and it involves speaking with characters one doesn't really want to engage with, or characters that the development community, certainly urbanists, aren't used to engaging with. But it must be done. If we want to have urban governance to be effective, under conditions of fragility, these are the types of stakeholders we do need to be open with and engage with and bring into dialogue.
Excellent, fantastic. I think you both have highlighted the importance of data, and it seems that in an increasingly hyper-connected world with the prevalence of mobile data handsets, we could perhaps leverage that to understand better what's happening with urban areas. I think UN Global Pulse are doing some relatively interesting work in this area. But I think Jaideep's highlighted an important question, both Jaideep and Robert, about equipping the municipal authorities with the skills to interpret the data that is made available to them. It's not just about bombarding people with information, but also enhancing their capacity to highlight the most relevant pieces of data. Robert, perhaps we could move on to you mentioned you had a data visualization that might kind of elaborate on some of these data points. Perhaps we could pull that up.
Sure. Give me for a second as I try to locate it. I think it's right. Let me just do this. So as I try to share my screen, is that being shown?
Yeah, that's just popped up.
Okay. So a couple of years ago, a number of researchers that I was fortunate enough to join in a consortia began asking some of these questions around the data points. And let me just expand the screen so we get the whole thing. And what we did was we started to scout. Well, first of all, we wanted to understand what constitutes fragility in terms of, from an empirical perspective. How do we measure it? And at the risk of offending many anthropologists and ethnographers who may be listening, we tried to narrow it down to a set of metrics. And the metrics that we selected were those had to pass two criteria. First, they had to be associated with, statistically associated or correlated with a measurable, let's call it, breakdown in the city social contract, in the quality and the distribution of services. So there had to be some kind of underlying scientific literature. It had to meet that evidence test. And the second criteria for looking at the data and selecting data was that there had to be some meaningful coverage around the world at the city scale. And the more we started to look around and try to understand, try to identify data sets that might meet both these criteria. In other words, be an independent variable for the, let's call it the volatility and disruption of a city, and also be available. The more we realized that this data was really scarce in a really tangible sense. And this was striking because, over the last couple of years, there's been a veritable explosion of activity around the world when it comes to discussions around cities, be it smart cities, be it infrastructure in cities, be it the implosion of cities, be it crime and justice in cities. There's a Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities initiative. There's the City Age at LSE. There's a huge number of different activities. And what was surprising is once you scrape the surface a little bit, you realize that most of that work was based on 5 or 6 or 10 or 15 case studies. And that's not to belittle that work, because I think it's been hugely important in helping shape the conversation. But it did suggest to us that we knew perhaps a little less than often what we claim to know. And this was worrying because many cities now are banding together across networks to form all sorts of alliances and networks and even codification of standards. And perhaps we didn't have baselines against which to really measure those standards. So with the United Nations University, with the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative, but also with a wide variety of other actors, a number of us at the Garabé Institute started to put together a data set using both administrative data, that is data that's collected through national statistics offices or through city offices or through private entities, but also unstructured data, sort of remote sensing data. And we came up with 11 metrics out of the hundreds of metrics that are out there. And keep in mind that these 11 metrics are, of course, imperfect. At the end of the day, they're ultimately imperfect proxies. There are, of course, enormous challenges with the data quality. But we put together 10 years of data across 11 metrics across over 2,100 cities with populations of 250,000 people or more. That number is a little bit arbitrary, but it is the largest data set of its kind. That number being the population size is a bit arbitrary, but it is the largest data set of its kind when it comes to cities. And I am proud to unveil this for the first time to a specialist audience at DIPID. This particular visualization isn't public yet, but I did show it just a couple of weeks ago at TED, as well as at Singularity University, and we showed it at Davos, and we'll be doing a couple of big launches once we refine it. So what you're seeing now is a prototype. Let me just kind of run through it very quickly, because there were a number of questions around data. What this tool allows you to do is it allows you to scan at a very kind of high resolution different cities. Right now they're bubbles. We're going to turn this into shape files in a moment. And when you hover over different cities, what you'll often get, if this will work, well, is a readout of the specific metrics in each of the cities. So the 11 indicators, just so I'm clear, that we've focused on are, number one, population growth, the speed of population growth. Now, population growth in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when you start passing a threshold of above 3.5% per year, you tend to find a harder correlation with certain forms of volatility in the city. And so what you'll see here from this random city we selected, Bhavnagar, with due respect to our colleagues who live in Bhavnagar, we see population growth of 1.56. The second big metric we look at is income inequality, and here measured by Gini coefficient. There is a fairly rich literature around, and Jaideep and others have alluded to it, around the relationship between income inequality and volatility in cities. Everyone understands that the Gini coefficient is on the scale of 0 to 1. Bhavnagar shows a relatively low income inequality in this case, compared to other comparative cities. But when you start seeing a higher, more acute levels of inequality, and I'll give some examples momentarily, you tend to see certain forms of volatility. Unemployment rates. In this case, we don't have the data point for unemployment, but unemployment, especially among young men, tends to be correlated with a higher rate of volatility. We've proxied service access by electricity access. We actually do have data for around the world for electricity. We look at air pollution. We look at homicide rates. Again, this particular city doesn't have a homicide rate that was publicly available, and we have checked with virtually every single city authority in the world personally in this particular 2,100 data set, city data set. But in this case, we couldn't find a meaningful homicide rate for 2015. Conflict events. This is based on a very large data set, could even describe as big data, which is produced by GDELT, the Geographic Location Data Events data set, which is based out of, I think, Georgetown. And essentially what they do is they mine thousands of media outlets, and every 15 seconds you're able to do a kind of sentiment analysis. So we looked at every single city and then geolocated the data, and we were able to identify the intensity of conflict events, annualized, and we come up with a percentage. And the whole methodology is explained in the under the help section of this particular tool. Then we have terrorist killings. And there's a GTB, which is a global terrorism data set, which has its limitations, but it gives city-based data on the number of killings per year. We look at the obviously the homicide rate. This is intentional homicide per 100,000. The UN Office for Drugs and Crime and many others collect data. We've been doing this for a couple of years and have a separate visualization where we visualize this data. And then we look at some of the environmental risks around cyclones, drought risk, flood risk. And we also ask that question about whether or not the city is located in a fragile country, or whether it's located in a country that could be defined by the UCDP in Sweden as a conflict-affected country. And so what you can do is literally go around the world. Here we have Hargeisa in Somalia. Here we have Kismayo in Somalia. And you can rotate the map geographically, physically. You can literally kind of go into the cities. You can start seeing outliers because you can have a three-dimensional visualization tool. And we basically produced a fragility score between 0 and 4. And this is a composite index of all 11 metrics put together. It's unweighted. We've tested various kinds of weights, and we found that the relationships still hold, whether or not you ascribe a whole variety of different weights. Keep in mind that the Human Development Index was unweighted. And we produced this very rough and ready score of cities around the world to give people a better sense of the distribution of fragility. And we've also broken it down by each filter. So these are the world's most fragile cities. These are cities that fall within the score of 3 to 4. These are the world's least fragile cities. Again, ones that fall between 0 and 2. They won't necessarily be a surprise to some people. These are filters for unemployment rates. We've done filters for inequality, and I'll finish in a moment. Filters for population growth. You can adjust this so you can look at the outliers at either end of the distribution curve. Again, we've looked at this geographically, so you can zoom in on different parts of the world, and you can kind of do this and see outliers. So, for example, here's Nyala in Sudan, which has a high fragility score and especially high population growth of 5.16. Way over here, we see Aden in Yemen. Again, very, very high population growth rate. Off in the distance, we see Kano in Nigeria. So, again, a useful tool to better understand distributions. And the final point I was going to mention was we've also done it so that you can look at scatter plots. For those people who aren't necessarily spatially minded but would like to see distributions between filters, here we look at the relationship between fragility, the score, and the inequality rate. And we'll see that those with high inequality and tend to have a high fragility score, like Boksburg in South Africa, or, say, Lusaka in Zambia, or, say, Brasilia, the country where I live, you tend to see also the correlations. And you can do this in 3 dimensions as well. So, again, we can look at outliers here at Baghdad in the extreme. The point of this isn't to give you a definitive roadmap or necessarily even a straight-up planning tool, but I think it's to start a conversation about the importance of data and data informing our interventions, a conversation about the clusters of cities that tend to aggregate across different filters and different kinds of variables, and a conversation about the importance also of the data gaps, because there are many cities for which we still are lacking some critical data against which it becomes impossible to determine whether we've seen successful interventions or not. The final point I'll mention as I close this off is that there are some interesting findings here. And at the very beginning of this session, William, you mentioned that fragile cities tend to cluster in fragile states, and fragile cities are perhaps more pronounced in conflict-affected countries. And this kind of discussion has really shaped a lot of the narrative around fragility and conflict prevention and peace building and stabilization and reconstruction. One of the interesting things when you break it down by cities, consider that we only have 193 plus minus countries, but we have thousands and thousands of cities, is that actually, although you do see a strong statistical relationship between a city's fragility and its location in a fragile or conflict-affected country, the fact is there are many, many more cities outside of fragile countries and conflict-affected countries that exhibit tendencies and properties of fragility. And this, I think, for anybody who works in DFID or outside in the field, they'll understand that a lot of cities exhibit, even Manchester and London, as we said in the very beginning, exhibit properties of fragility. This is a real wake-up call, especially when we think about 2/3 of global GDP being based in cities, and we see the future of our economy and many of our collective action dilemmas being resolved at city scale, that we understand that this fragility exhibits and manifests itself in a much more discrete and complex ways than often this rather narrow categories of fragility and conflict that are ascribed at the nation-state scale.
Fantastic.
Sorry for that. That was a little long.
No. That's really useful. I think it clearly highlighted the role data can play in visualizing kind of fragile cities. I think it's also important to note that it's pockets within cities that will be fragile. So, for example, London, you will have certain estates where there are it's more prone to violence or crime. I mean, I think we'll return to the data point in the question and answer section, because I think there'll be a lot of questions around that. I think also highlighting the role data can play for urban communities that are traditionally disenfranchised and how they can leverage the prevalence of mobile phones to record and hold governments to account by reporting instances of poor service delivery, etc. But I think that's a point we can pick up towards the end of the question and answer section. So finally, in the final question I had, the international community has identified the challenges posed by rapid urbanisation as a pressing concern. As noted, Goal 11 of the Sustainable Development Goals calls for the creation of sustainable cities and communities with a focus on making cities inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. UN Habitat is leading debates in this area, articulating a new urban agenda that calls for the international community to embrace urbanisation at all levels of human settlements, integrate equity to the urban development agenda, foster national urban planning and plan city extensions, decide how relevant sustainable development goals will be supported through sustainable urbanisation, and to align and strengthen institutional arrangements. I think we can all agree this is lofty rhetoric and ambition. So in practical terms, what is the role of international community, multilateral and bilateral donors, and civil society? Perhaps most importantly, the civil society in this question, because we haven't talked much about that in supporting urban governance. Jaideep, perhaps we could go to you for that question.
Sure, thanks, William. Now, to me, the role the international community that includes multilateral, bilateral donors, as well as civil society, is crucially important in all of this. And we certainly shouldn't think that this is the purview of city mayors alone. And this importance is articulated in my mind in several ways, right? So to start at the global level, we've spoken about this a little bit already. The international community should recognize the centrality of urban areas and not just urban areas, but the processes leading to urbanization, because these are continually happening. Right? So urbanization isn't happening at the same rate in North America and Europe, but it certainly is still going on at a furious pace across Africa and Asia. So recognize the centrality of these processes to the challenges of international development. Right, and indeed, as you've mentioned, William, in your brief comments just then, that this is already happening in very concrete ways. The SDGs are talking cities. New urban agenda obviously is picking up steam, and I think we do need to underscore in this the spectrum of rural to peri-urban to urban linkages, but we also need to recognize that urban poverty and vulnerability is fundamentally different in rural and urban contexts. Right? So this means the challenges of governance are also fundamentally of a different nature. So our paradigms, our methods, our tools, indicators, as Rob was mentioning, need to simultaneously reflect the linkages, but also the specificities of rural and urban contexts. And I think the international community has a big role to play in setting up that agenda. The second role the international community can play is on building the evidence base, and we've already sort of spoken on this a little bit, but I did want to to speak a little bit about focusing on the appropriate parameters and indicators. Now, the visualization that Rob showed is an excellent step forward in this regard. I mean, the one thing that really stood out to me in the maps that he showed was, this is one of the first times, I think it is the first time, that you can look at fragile and cities that are not fragile in just a click of a button, right? So there was a lot of focus and hype around fragility, but not so much around cities that are safe. And when these occur, within a few 100 kilometers of one another or less, there are real questions that need to be asked. And another point around evidence-based, and we've already mentioned this, but I'll point out specific points here again in terms of evidence coming out of second and third tier urban areas, right? So, I mean, small towns account for half of the global urban population. But if you look at a specific category of small towns, so those small towns that are projected to grow into larger cities, so, with a population greater than 500,000, we find the 10 fastest growing are located in 4 countries. It's a very interesting set of 4 countries: Angola, the DRC, South Sudan, and India. Okay, so Lubango in Angola and Bunia in DRC turn out to be the fastest growing small towns in this category. And I guess the question is, how much do we really know about governance institutions in these cities? And it's a really eclectic mix. As I mentioned, it includes the capital Juba in South Sudan, but also, if I'm not mistaken, Roorkee and Begusarai in India. So what's going on in these rapidly growing small towns? Who are the service providers? What does poverty and vulnerability look like in these locations? Most importantly, though, who is being left behind as these urban areas grow into larger cities? Right? That's a very big question, and a question that we really don't have the answers to just as yet. A third point, and I guess final point in this, there's a lot more to say on this, but in my view, one of the most important roles for the international and donor community, and this is where civil society can play a particularly important role in supporting urban governance, is by not pushing the issues of safety, security, violence mitigation to play second fiddle. Okay, now there's a real need, as I've said already, to integrate these across all approaches to urban development. Now, this is not to say that every urban area is somehow impeded by violence. Okay, far from it. As we saw in Rob's map here, there are very many cities that are safe. But we do need to recognize that fragility in urban areas is very multidimensional. Right? Rob was saying London and Manchester have aspects of fragility in them. And huge proportions of the urban population globally face risks and insecurity, not just from violence and conflict, but also from natural disasters. Now, these risks are disproportionately borne by the urban poor, and so the lived experiences of poverty and vulnerability in urban areas should really be regarded as the entry points for the international community in the effort to support urban governance.
William, can I just add one small point, just very briefly?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Just 2 kind of, I think, interesting trends that underline the importance of thinking about donor engagement with cities. The first is, I think, that our and we can contest this, but our nation states and our multilateral institutions are demonstrating themselves, I think, to be increasingly ill-equipped, unable, maybe even paralyzed to act on some of the biggest collective action problems we have right now in the world. Be it migration. I mean, we've all been delighted with the outcomes of Paris. We saw what a torturous road it took us to get there. What often wasn't discussed was the critical role of C40, as well as hundreds of other mayors that joined that effort to lobby aggressively for that process to go forward. But not just climate change, migration, governance, terrorism. I mean, some of the biggest issues right now are not being adequately addressed by our national and our multilateral institutions. The UN Security Council is utterly paralyzed and will be for the foreseen future. And so, this raises, I think, some fundamental questions for donors about what is the appropriate scale of intervention. It's not either or. I see cities as a complementary layer, but it does raise some interesting questions about the most appropriate entry points. And the fact is our multilateral systems are still very much oriented towards dealing at the national scale, dealing with centralized formal institutions, most often our treasuries, our ministries of the interior, our ministries of health, our ministries of education. So there's a big set of questions I think donors are going to have to start asking themselves about how do we engage at this level, how do we manage the tensions of sovereignty, of national and municipal interests, how do we finance these interventions, and there's been some really interesting innovative financing mechanisms that have been introduced by the World Bank and the IDB to deal with cities in Latin America, which I think is a front-line area for thinking about innovations around incubating successful municipal intervention. So the second point, I think, is it's at the same time as nation-states and multilateral institutions are being, in a way, gripped by a certain kind of paralysis, and I don't want to overstretch that point, but I think it's true at one level, cities are also becoming, in a way, much more powerful, or at least some cities are becoming much more powerful. They are highly networked by capital, by ideas, by people, by diasporas. And so this linkages between cities, I think, is something, on the one hand, that can enhance resilience. It also presents new forms of vulnerability in this checkerboard or rather the chessboard even of the world. And so just thinking about ways that international agencies can engage, the first, I think, is to recognize that cities are an appropriate and legitimate entry point for investment, and to think about the structures and systems and incentives to allow for that kind of investment, which is a big, big ask. The second is, I think, to create forums for cooperation, for sharing, for twinning, for setting standards. And we're seeing that happen spontaneously, the ECLG being one prime example of this, but there are many other networks that are forming. I'm involved, for example, in something called a Global Parliament of Mayors, which will be launched in The Hague in 2 months, where we're bringing a couple of hundred mayors together to talk about some of these global collective action problems and to think about, I don't want to be too bold, but sort of alternate systems of global governance, but have a conversation about what this means about intervention. And I think, just to go back to Jaideep's point, to create the spaces also to reflect on and to challenge some of the assumptions we have about informality at this scale. There is, and I know that DFID is well beyond this, but it's important to mention it, there is a sort of binary view, right, of informal settlements being, on the one hand, dystopic, apocalyptic areas of vice and violence. On the other hand, sort of the Ed Glazer view that somehow, favelas and shantytowns are a celebration of global capital. They're a sign of a thriving city. And I think the reality is that these informal areas, where 90% of future urban growth is going to take place, is highly heterogeneous, highly complex, and we barely have a sense of we haven't really made it legible. And so a real effort has to happen within DFID and other areas to begin to engage substantively with these areas of informality, because that's not just 9% of urban growth is going to happen in the global south, especially Africa and Asia. It's 95% of the growth is going to be happening in areas that we might describe as informal. So we got to get to grips with that.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to leave you guys. I'm going to open up to questions from the audience. I'm not sure if we've had any of those come in yet. While we gather those, I'll posit one question. I mean, we've talked a lot about the importance of data in understanding best happening within cities. It's clear that understanding the context and situation of the urban poor is challenging. Perhaps, Jaideep, you could talk a little bit more about the role of ICTs, mobile phones, the internet, in both augmenting the capacity of municipal governments, but also empowering urban residents to hold their governments to account. I think you both worked quite a lot on this area.
Sure, William, and I'm sure that Rob has some interesting findings to share as well on this. I mean, I can speak at length, but let me give you a couple of examples from initiatives that we've been involved with recently. So one was collecting real-time data on individuals' well-being outcomes. So we were focusing on the well-being outcomes of informal workers who share the additional burden of living in an informal settlement. And we did this, we sort of piloted this across 6 cities in South Asia, looking at a variety of informal settlements. And there the idea really was to provide a complementary measure to the more traditional understandings of poverty, which are income-based or consumption-based. So these sets of measures, and they'll soon be sort of published, but the initial reports are already up online to view, focus on what people's own priorities are, what they need to live well in a city, what their life ambitions are, either in the very short run or in the longer term, and what their satisfaction levels on those goals are. So often when we're talking about what the right indicators are to measure outcomes in cities, we sort of flip that on its head, saying, well, why don't we ask the so-called respondents in the surveys what their measures really are? And rather than getting a really eclectic mix of all kinds of things, we found that there's quite a lot of clarity in this type of an approach. And in terms of using ICTs, we found it really powerful to have slum dwellers, or we visited about 14 informal settlements in which we conducted this census-style survey, where the data was being inputted on tablets. They were all sort of very obviously savvy on the latest technology, the latest Samsung gadgets, and these kinds of surveys can be emailed out, texted out to people, and it gives you a real sense of what current opinions are. And then it translates into any measures civil society use to lobby local governments, or to use them for their own advocacy needs. Right? So there's some there's benefits to having real-time data for advocacy needs. And if I've got a moment, we've also been doing work with the Kerala police in the city of Thiruvananthapuram, for instance, where instead of taking police officers off the streets and into the training centers, because we found that more than 85% of police personnel in cities in India do not get any crime-fighting training or skills. So there's real opportunity costs in taking them off the streets to train them. We've developed a platform that sends training material, visual and written material, onto their mobile phones. So they can view this material at particular points in the day when they're having a off time from their beats, and importantly, this type of training material can be sent to particular groups of police officers. So, for instance, police that are meant to conduct their duties at a particular religious festival can be informed of the do's and don'ts of that particular day, or indeed, there can be a little quiz and checklist on how to conduct certain policing duties. I found this is, quite a interesting and attractive way, particularly for the police on ground. But I'll pass over to Rob, who'll have a lot more interesting stuff to say on ICTs and data in this area.
I don't know if it's more interesting, but I have a few quick observations. I mean, and some of which involve DFID, which may make it a little more interesting for those who may be listening. The first point maybe to mention is that there has been this, everyone knows it, but there has been this information explosion, and not just in terms of the availability of information, but the production of information, and the tools by which information can be produced. And so there's a real exciting, I think, sets of ecosystems that are emerging in cities when it comes to new technology and the use of open source and even proprietary tools to improve, let's call it, the quality of urban life writ large. And I couldn't have said this 5 years ago. We're really seeing a tremendous wave of disruptive technologies, often at very low cost, easily accessible tools that are shrinking the digital divides both between countries and within them, between cities and within cities, and even within neighborhoods. So in my city in Rio, where I live right now, there is almost equal internet access in the low-income and the middle-income areas. Virtually everybody has a cell phone, even if they're using credit for the phone. So you have both a massive penetration of information tech as well as penetration of access. And I think we've moved well beyond the Ushahidi sort of style platform, which has dominated the last, I'd say, 5 to 6 years of this discussion. And again, we work very closely with Ushahidi, but I think there's a lot more going on. So just 4 quick examples. First, you're seeing, I think, in many of the Caribbean and even parts of Africa, the emergence of literally city pulses. distributed, decentralized, mobile-based systems of reporting from citizens to authorities, and the other way in the other direction as well. It's not necessarily top-down. These are often bottom-up initiatives that are really revolutionizing the nature of reporting on everything from health, education, service, road services, public transport, all the way to crime. And what's interesting, I think, now is that a lot of these are real-time. You know, we're talking in minute increments, which can be used by citizens for their own day-to-day activities. The second kind of area where I think there's a lot of exciting, I would say, innovation is around real-time crime mapping. We're involved in designing systems sort of based on loosely on a ComStat, a computer statistics style program that was developed in New York in the 1990s. But we've made it open source. And the idea here is you can track the spatial, temporal, demographic distribution of crime, violence, perceptions of crime in close to real time. And everybody knows that the vast majority of crime concentrates in it's hyper-concentrated in very small areas. And the idea here is to reduce the gap between the objective, actual incidence of crime and the perception of crime as it may occur, and to create interfaces for the public to engage with this. A third kind of tool that we're developing with DFID is an open-source body camera tool, which essentially what we're doing is we've designed an Android and iOS application that police can use anywhere, that essentially runs off their phone and captures the video, audio, GPS coordinates of the officer. And the idea here is to increase the accountability over those officers, because of a supervisor who can monitor this in real time, but also reduce the discretionary space for them to use excessive use of force or to engage in bribery. And we're now running this in about 4 different cities across Brazil, with 1,500 different officers in Cape Town, Johannesburg, and we're expanding it across the Americas and Africa this year. Citizen cameras are sort of riffing on the same theme. The idea that citizens can use their mobile phones now, not just to report on crime or police abuse, but on everything from public transport to dengue, or disease, or puddles, or ways of improving the efficiency and effectiveness of cities, and to give citizens a voice, which I think ultimately is really, really important if we talk about creating inclusive spaces within cities. So a lot of really, I think, exciting activity. I think for DFID, the message here is that a lot of this is already happening. There are tremendous hackers and students who are hyper-literate in this kind of technology. It doesn't have to be off the shelf, purchased and licensed. You can get a lot of value out of open-source tools. And I would really encourage people to go out there and explore, wherever you may be working, what that ecosystem looks like, and to tap into it, because I think it's really rich, really diverse, really exciting. I think promises not to bring in a new age of smart cities in that kind of northern sense, but to really make cities smarter from the bottom up.
And I think the important point you make is that a lot of this is already happening. It's being locally led by organized groups such as iHub in Kenya, or the kind of citizen mapping in Map Kibera. I mean, I think other examples are kind of, monitoring perceptions of Indonesian public policies via Twitter, which UN Global Pulse is doing. So I think there's a diverse array of initiatives underway that could be leveraged, I think, is your suggestion, and kind of upscaled, for want of a better word. I think we've had one question come in from William Turner. He's highlighting sometimes the tension between national and municipal governance and their competing priorities. His question relates to how can donors navigate this tension and address these tensions, often working at both levels. Over to you guys, whoever wants to respond.
Yeah, just a very brief point on this. Sorry, Rob, did you want to jump in? Or?
No, handing over to you.
I mean, the first. I mean, this is a really important question, and this is really getting down to the brass tacks of it, because the first step really is to recognize that these tensions do exist. Very often in much of the urban literature, you see the politics that cities have to put up with, within their immediate local environment, against cities. They often put up to compete with other cities within the same country, and then relationships between city and central governments are not always rosy. And so, to recognize these tensions, I think, is a big first step. Of course, multilateral, bilateral donors have, a major hurdle they need to contend with is often getting access to the city. which is often mediated through the central government. And if that relationship isn't a holistic one, then you often find the priorities of national governments, which are reflected in the types of cities they want investment directed towards, being naturally sort of passed on to donor programming. Now there isn't, as all things in politics, there's no easy, clean answer to this. I mean, one way also that we've been sort of trying to explore, working with both city level and national officials, is to, again, going back to the example on well-being that I highlighted, is to showcase where some of the policy gaps might be, and to showcase this in a way that is understood both by city level and national level sort of policymakers. And this is really about, trying to highlight the potential mismatches between what communities need to survive and to live well in a city, and what is actually being provided by the city. And often we found that there's several instances where urban service provision might be very sort of patchy, and in the areas that it is being provided is really not the areas that are being prioritized by the communities. And if this is presented in a way that sort of highlights the lack of value for money, or getting a bang for your buck, city and central governments tend to understand those types of tensions. This obviously again varies region to region. So, for instance, again in South Asia, in India, where you don't really have the type of mayoral position that we sort of have spoken about through this webinar. The mayor isn't really the person who runs things in a city. You have several layers of political arrangements and governance arrangements that you need to contend with if you want to enter the space. Now, that is not to say that there are more hurdles to intervening in the urban space. This is to say that when we do intervene, it needs to be in recognition that there are several competing political agendas that are often at play in a very localized environment, and that cities are not apolitical beasts. They're very political entities, as are towns. And recognizing this has to lead to better programming and better interventions.
Okay, Robert, over to you. Any comments on that?
I think Jaideep's done a marvelous job of describing it. I mean, I would just underline the importance of identifying these tensions, and there's going to be some spade work required, because it's going to be an issue that's going to grow. This is going to be a yawning challenge, especially in those areas where DFID works. About these divergent expectations, where centralized institutions that have had and have been the dominant force in politics and economics for the last, let's say, 50, 60 years, are going to be coming under pressure from growing networks of cities that are going to be demanding a greater share of the pie, or at least decision-making. So the first thing I think I agree with Jaideep fully is to recognize the tensions. The second, I think, is DFID could play a role potentially in helping develop shared problem definition panels or platforms, so that there can be that discussion. Too often, I think, the centralized authorities are remote from what's happening in cities, unless their constituency happens to be in one, and they don't understand the problems. It's incredible how insulated our politicians are at the federal level, or the national level, from what's actually happening on the ground. I only have to look as far as Brasilia and the rest of Brazil to really see that extraordinary gap. So creating platforms for politicians, elected officials at the central level, to engage with their partners or others in a sensitive and respectful way, to help align expectations and share in the identification of problems is one useful tool. I think the SDGs, in a way, provide an excellent opportunity against which you can start doing some of this benchmarking exercise, because there is a recognition, I think, both endogenously within the SDGs, but also, I think, in terms of the new world we live in, or the world we live in, that this SDGs don't apply uniquely to national institutions, but they apply equally to subnational and city-level institutions. So using this rather expansive set of goals, the 17 goals and however many metrics, as a baseline against which to have this this discussion, I think would be very useful, and it would align beautifully with DFID's mandate. Final thing might be around, or two final things might be around, one, creating pooled funds or mechanisms in which joint decisions can be made when it comes to donor resources at the city scale, so that there is some stake, or at least some say, by some national officials in this process. That might help diffuse some of the tensions, but it could also raise new ones. But this idea of having consultative mechanisms whereby a number of stakeholders can engage in discussions around investment. And the final, I think, most powerful mechanism for donors, not DFID exclusively, is to empower citizens at the city scale to speak out. You know, so I think if citizens, and there's a danger here of tyranny of the masses, or favoring large cities over smaller, medium-sized ones. But if citizens can be given a voice in highlighting or articulating their priorities, politicians, whether they're at the municipal, state, or federal level, will listen. And so this is where I think we go back to that last set of questions. There's a whole ecosystem of digital tools, both through conventional and also social media, but also increasingly through, the blogospheres and other cyberspace that can help, I think, facilitate, enable this conversation, encourage more effective decision making. But I think I simply want to agree that it's a very, very tricky question. You are striking at the heart of issues around sovereignty and shared sovereignty, and I think I wish DFID well.
Yeah, no, fantastic.
William, I just had a quick additional point there. And when we talk of this relationship between city level and national level, increasingly we need to recognize that there's a third player or a third sort of arena that comes into this equation, and that is all the stakeholders that have that are involved in building an infrastructure. Right, and this is increasingly dominated by large private sector conglomerates, and the scale of this is, we forget, but is monumental, right? So, in India alone, about 80% of the infrastructure that's required to house the population in the coming decades hasn't yet been built, and I think the percentage for global infrastructure required is about the same. And currently we spend globally about 3, 4, I think 5 times the amount on infrastructure as we do on global defense. So this is, I mean, the incentives to sort of garner collective voice towards you are huge, monumentally huge in this space. And so, we must expect this third player to have a big stake in this, and they do. They're constantly involved in all types of negotiations, right from the neighborhood level up to the city to the center. And so when we look to navigate this space, we'll often find, if not overtly, some sort of inadvertent interventions and inadvertent sort of influencing from this third sector as well.
Mm. And I think that's an important point that hasn't been touched on much in this discussion, the financing of our urban centres and the dependency of many cities on central government for transfers of funds. I mean, I think this is a question about capacity, about enhancing the ability of city governments to engage with private sector in public-private partnerships, to leverage the private sector to develop some of this infrastructure in a way that works both for the city, but also for urban residents within the city and is inclusive, leaves no one behind, etc. I think on that note, we are almost out of time. I mean, if either of you have any kind of final concluding comments you want to make, or a plea to DFID about a forward research agenda, feel free to say that now. Otherwise, I will bid adieu to all of you.
I would simply say that, look, we work very closely as an organization with DFID and others, and we're here as a strategic resource. And so if there are any questions, any pleas for data, if there are any suggestions on innovations that perhaps we ought to look at and evaluate, subject to robust RCT-style research, let us know. I can be reached at the eGarapé Institute, and of course we're here to respond and support you in your efforts.
Fantastic. Jaideep?
Yeah, very similarly. I mean, we obviously, a lot of our work has and is being supported by DFID. We're a small group focusing on cities, but we're also part of a very sort of a large national and international network, working with some of the key urban players, key urbanists, key urban thinkers, as well as sort of a ready network of researchers on ground. And so our approach to this is to present sort of evidence-based policy recommendations. So we're very open to continuing this conversation. I can be reached at, and found on the IDS Cities cluster page, also on Twitter and Facebook, obviously, and very happy to engage on any of these conversations.
Fantastic. So I think we can all conclude it's a challenge, but there is room for optimism and further engagement. Well, I'd like to thank you all for your participation in today's conversation. As mentioned earlier, resources mentioned during this webinar will be circulated to participants. A big thank you to our discussants, Jaideep and Robert, and to DFID for funding this event. And yeah, I look forward to further engagement. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.